Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. Today, we're going to cover the basic tools for threat and vulnerability programs. So one thing to start off with, this is going to be part of a much larger series. We're going to cover other topics such as the threat landscape, vulnerability management, software security, and so on. What are you going to learn today? Today, we're going to cover the basics of threat and vulnerability programs. We'll take a look at a few optional tools and focuses for threat and vulnerability programs. We're also going to take a look at a historical perspective related to vulnerability management. That's going to include such areas as configuration management, software security, prioritization mechanisms. So the sections we're going to cover include defining threat and vulnerability evolution, and Cyvergence threat and vulnerability services. So it should be noted, this is a very high-level presentation. It is not intended to cover absolutely everything related to vulnerability management. There is a lot going on. In the last 5 years, we've had a revolution in terms of what companies are focusing on, how they're doing threat and vulnerability. So this is also going to be a moderately technical discussion. We're going to provide basic explanations. We're not going to be doing a deep dive on any topic today. All of them do deserve deeper dives, but we're not going to be covering that today. So please keep that in mind. Also, this is not intended to be prescriptive. Just because I'm going to be covering software security as part of threat and vulnerability, it doesn't mean that this is appropriate for your organization. Please keep that in the back of your mind. So at any rate, let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's get into defining threat and vulnerability programs. So the purpose of a threat and vulnerability program is really to reduce or mitigate risk. So it's about focusing a lot of those IT operational efforts towards the right set of vulnerabilities by incorporating threats into the assessment. So this is a little bit of an advanced definition of a threat and vulnerability program. But in general, it does not include things like, is there a firewall in front of your web server? Now, not having one is a grave concern, but it's not considered an issue from a threat and vulnerability perspective. Somebody who is a manager or a director within that role may bring that up as a noted missing item, but that doesn't mean that it's including everything. So a threat and vulnerability program is really concerned with specific assets. And does the asset have a particular vulnerability related to that? So a vulnerability, think of it as a software weakness, something that an attacker could ultimately exploit. This could be a black hat hacker who is doing something from a negative perspective, or it could be a white hat, something that a white hat hacker could find. They're trying to do things from a positive perspective. But that ultimately is where the risk is. So think of a vulnerability as something that an attacker can take advantage of, but it could be something as simple as they can knock a particular system offline. And there's a lot of ways that that can take place, but it could be as complete as owning the entire system. They have full access to the entire box as a result of the vulnerability. So these are huge considerations. So this ultimately is where the risk is, because if an attacker can't gain access to a vulnerability, they can't gain access to an asset except as authorized. A web server, again, is a very good place to take a look at this. But ultimately, this is where the risk is for organizations. So when you're looking at the scope of a threat and vulnerability program, I like to break it down into two different areas. I like to break it down into infrastructure and then application or software security. From an infrastructure perspective, this doesn't include things like workstations and laptops. Pretty much everybody here should be familiar with those concepts. But there are also things like servers that are out there. Think of a server as a really, really powerful workstation and has a lot of extra bells and whistles that allow an IT operation to run effectively behind the scenes. So that's essentially what you're looking at. But there's also things like Linux and Unix. Think of them as, there's some exceptions to this, but think of them as additional servers within organizations that are required to run different types of software. But there's also mobile devices, phones, iPads, and a whole bunch of other paraphernalia along those lines. But there's network devices too. Now, most of us from our home systems are looking at possibly a firewall or even a router, and that's how you're going to get connectivity. But those should be in scope from an infrastructure perspective too. Now, IoT devices, for those who are not familiar, think of it as a thing. The very first IoT device was created in 1990 and was a toaster. But now it's expanded out far beyond just simple IoT devices. There's OT devices, IoMT, Internet of Medical Things, gated devices, and so on. But there is a whole hodgepodge of different IoT devices that are out there that should be included as part of the infrastructure vulnerability management. Also, cloud software is part of that too, because they can have vulnerabilities from a cloud perspective that need to be incorporated as well. On the software side of the house, there are two main things to take into account: open source software and software development. Open source software is used by almost every company today. What they're doing is they're grabbing software that's being developed by anybody in the world and pulling that into their environment and using that as a building block to create a stronger, better environment for the organization. So from an open source standpoint, obviously, if you have anybody who can design anything and build something, well, there's going to be some mistakes, there's going to be some vulnerabilities that are added into it, and there's going to be some additional challenges from an open source standpoint. But again, it saves companies a tremendous amount of development time, so they're not all redeveloping the wheel over and over again. And then there, of course, a lot of companies are doing software development. Open source is considered part of that software development process. So those are the two major scopes when I look at vulnerability management that I like to take into account. But let's get into a practical threat and vulnerability evolution. So I'm going to start with infrastructure. And so it's not typically called infrastructure, but I'm doing that to make it a little more clear. If you talk about a vulnerability management program, it's assumed that infrastructure is what you're talking about, generally speaking. And it does get a little bit blurry as we go through time, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. Now, from a legend perspective, you notice here in the lower left-hand corner, there are 3 different colors. And part of the reason I do that is because some of these tools and practices can be used from multiple standpoints. They can be used from an infrastructure standpoint. We can get into configurations, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. And then it also can be used from a software perspective. I do take a very broad view when I take a look at these things. So bear with me as we go through that, and I think you'll understand the perspective of where we're coming from. So one of the misconceptions that's out there is that cybersecurity started in the 2000s. It's a new discipline. And the reality is there have been while the first CISO did start in the 2000s, it actually started much earlier. So you can see here there's penetration testing. And penetration testing and little elements and little tools that were created here and there actually started back in the 60s and 70s. This is on something called a mainframe. And there are a lot of different mainframes that are being used much earlier than most of the modern computing that we had today. But they were doing micro tests on system to determine if there were different flaws that somebody could take advantage of. It's a really critical part of protecting systems, and it's been around for decades. But it wasn't until the mid-90s when we first saw the first vulnerability scanner. So what it did, it took all these tools and tried to find out what are the weaknesses, what are the vulnerabilities that are part of individual systems. And they can scan, say, a Windows systems or a Linux system and try to determine what they are and report back to you. They're going to tell you, is that a critical, high, medium, or low vulnerability, and help you with a little bit of the prioritization. Now, later on, and we ended up with automated penetration testing. This is, yes, there were some scripts that are being written much earlier than this, but this is where you first started finding the applications that can go ahead and do the testing against that, and it would do it in a very automated fashion. And so that was like another step in the evolution of the threat and vulnerability practice. And this gets a little bit larger than just the vulnerability management. So there's something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework that was created in 2013. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is a systematic assessment and catalog of all the different ways that companies can be compromised. So it's a way of identifying and clearly specifying what the different issues were. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is extraordinarily important in this evolution. For example, you'll notice below, you'll see breach and attack simulation. Breach and attack simulation largely jumps off of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but many of them have a tremendous number of capabilities that are far beyond the MITRE ATT&CK framework as well. All of these are continually evolving and growing technologies. For example, the vulnerability scanners, when they were just getting started, they weren't agent-based. They weren't logging into individual systems. And many of them weren't doing that for some time. But, early on, you ended up with agent-based ones. So it wasn't until, I think, like in the early 2000s, I think in the year 2000, we had our first SaaS-based vulnerabilities tool. So it was scanning things from the open internet. But that agent was calling back to the SaaS server to let you know what the vulnerabilities were. So there's a lot that's going on in terms of an evolutionary perspective, but also we see something called attack surface management. So attack surface management is very different than a vulnerability scanner. Typically in the past, what most corporations did is they scanned the external network to see if they could see any vulnerabilities from an attacker's perspective on the open internet. Well, they were focused primarily on those infrastructure vulnerabilities. They went a little bit larger than that, but that was the general focus of the vulnerability scanners. They weren't sufficient. So what happened is in the last several years, there was something called attack surface management that started to come in, external attack surface management that started to come into play. External attack surface management scans applications and it covers infrastructure to find out what the individual issues are. And they also get into configurations too, which make it far more powerful than what you're able to do just with a typical vulnerability scanner. And that's why it's starting to gain traction today. In fact, there are a lot of tools on the market that started to precipitate the need for doing this because they recognized that the scope was much larger than what was happening in the past. But another angle that is sort of interesting is software composition analysis. Those who are on the application side of the house, the software development side of the house, may recognize that type of tool. It is not typically within the infrastructure vulnerability management program. So what you'd find though is what it does, it scans the individual applications, as they come in for open source software. So if somebody's downloading a piece of open source software, it's looking for the vulnerabilities prior to being able to implement it within an organization. So it's a really critical piece of tool today. Some estimates show that there is upwards of 55% of the applications have high vulnerabilities in them. Some of them even are compromised, or you're bringing in a Trojan horse into your environment and you may not even be aware of it. So software composition analysis detects those problems early on. For those who are used to the Linux world, oftentimes they bring in applications just as part of what they do. So being able to use software composition analysis from an infrastructure standpoint can be extraordinarily valuable. But let's cover attack pathway analysis. It's yet another way that threat and vulnerability has evolved. And you're starting to see companies starting in the 2010s starting to focus on attack pathway analysis. And so what it does, it takes a look at how an attacker would get into your system. And if they see a way to get into the system, they're going to analyze what are the antecedents that could be connected to as a result of that initial compromise. So if they're able to get in, say, through a virtual private network, then they can probably gain access to a lot of other resources. In the security world, we revert to open networks, for example, as crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside, because then the access is so much higher than it would otherwise be. So attack pathway analysis is another method to help prioritize where the focus should be for your efforts. So if you can block that initial attack vector, the other ones become a little bit less important. So it is another part of that vulnerability process. Another interesting evolution was the crowdsourced pen testing. This is where multiple people are able to log in from an authorized perspective and attack your organization in order to report them and not just attack it and create a problem. So there's a lot of companies that are focusing in this direction as well. So in general, when we're talking about infrastructure, this is what we're talking about. But there's a related area, the configurations, which bring a whole new angle to this. So configurations are part of most vulnerability tools today. So you're going to find things like CIS baselines, for example. And let's go ahead and start to talk about where all this fits in. Many of you will notice that there is something called the Rainbow series here. If you want to talk about early cybersecurity, this is a really good place to reference. Not many companies are using them today, but I will occasionally come across companies who do use them as a foundation for ensuring that you're configuring things properly. There are some questions that are much deeper in the Rainbow series than what you're going to find in some of these others. And so it isn't a bad reference point, but not all modern applications are able to meet all the requirements that are there, but it's still a really good place to go. The Rainbow series, generally speaking, is considered deprecated today. It's antique from the 1980s and 70s. So what is used, though, is a CIS baseline. From a commercial standpoint, that is the most common tool that's used to protect organizations from a configuration standpoint. It should be noted that vulnerability scanners do have configuration monitoring. Now, that's because the vulnerabilities sometimes are specifically related to configurations. But when you look at configuration management, when you consider something like the CIS baselines or some of the other topics we're going to discuss below, they do include some configurations that are far beyond what you're going to get in a vulnerability management program. So you get a little bit of a bleed over in this area. So this is very normal. This is because they're looking at things from a very different standpoint. In the next slide, or the 2 slides from now, we're going to talk about the prioritization mechanisms, and there's something called common vulnerability exposures out of the common vulnerability scoring system. And what that does, they will have configurations that are part of it. So just bear with me as we go through it. It's a little bit confusing, but it's all true if you're diving into it. But anyway, so CIS baselines cover things like Windows servers, databases, applications. There's a lot of things that it's covering, all the operating systems. There's a lot that are covered. So there's a lot of different that you can baselines that you can pull down. Now, CIS is the Center for Internet Security. It's some of the requirements are built into the standards today from a compliance standpoint. So take something like PCI, the payment card industry. They do include the CIS baselines as part of the requirements. But prior to that, we also had something called the DISA STIGs. DISA stands for the Defense Information Systems Agency, and STIGs is Secure Technical Implementation Guides. So this is essentially the de facto standard when it comes to federal security for many years. And eventually what they did is they came up with another tool, the Secure Content Automation Protocol, which is now in many cases, not in all, superseding the DISA STIGs. The DISA STIGs just recently became deprecated, and they're not developing more DISA STIGs. But what you're seeing now is the Federal Desktop Core Configuration, which is also deprecated, and the U.S. Government Configuration Baseline. Now, those work off of something called Secure Content Automation Protocol. I'm not going to go into the full details behind it, but just know that all of these are configuration standards. These lower standards, the DISA STIGs, FDCC, the USGCB, all of those are really good standards. They're some of the toughest standards in the industry to meet. They're not considered everything, but they're a really good starting point for protecting organizations today. So let's get into software development. Again, pen testing we've already spoke about in the past, but the 3 major types of software development tools that are out there, we have something called static application security testing. And this is a really important one to know, because what it's doing, it's scanning the individual code. So the developers develop the code, they throw it into a static application security testing tool, and it finds what the vulnerabilities are. What are the problems with their code that they're developing? It is a really critical step for being able to protect organizations today. Now, if I'm going to jump below to the dynamic application security testing, it's a little bit different, and it's not done at the coding level. What it's done is when the application, like a web application, for example, is stood up and is running, dynamic application security testing is going to be checking that to see if there's any vulnerabilities. Now, it's going to be logging into a web application is one option. You can run it without that, but it can also do a login to be able to determine, are there any internal vulnerabilities that are not necessarily noticed by the individual tools? And so then finally, we have the interactive application security testing. So interactive is something that's happening while the software is running and is checking on it. It's not considered a scan. So in general, these are the 3 basic types of tools that are being used in the software development process. Of course, you're going to find software composition analysis. Breach and attack simulation can be used, like if you set it up in what's called a QA environment, a quality assurance environment. So you could stand up the application, run some of these software tools against it and try to determine if you have anything. So breach and attack simulation and attack surface management are the primary ways of doing things. Now, software composition analysis is definitely being used, but that's before you even pull the code into your application if you're following a best practice. And of course, we've got some automated penetration testing that's specifically to applications. So penetration testing is typically much larger than just a vulnerability assessment because you're going to look for human logic flaws that a lot of the tools can't work with. But today, what we're finding is some of these tools are being automated from a pen testing standpoint to create a faster response time in the work that's being done. It still is a very creative field, and there's a lot that's going on from a pen testing standpoint, but this gives you a general idea of what are the major tools that are being used in software development today from a threat and vulnerability perspective. So prioritization. Now, one of the things that we've seen over time is there have been a large number of new vulnerabilities that are out there. It is a very, very complex space, and there's a lot going on. So what we see here in 1999, we had the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. This was a way to prioritize vulnerabilities, basically high, medium, and low. And so this has evolved over time. That was version 1 that we saw in 1999. Now we're on version 4, which was just released a few months ago in 2023. Other types of prioritization mechanisms that are out there, there's something called OWASP, you can see below. That's the Open Source Web Application Security Project. And what it does, it has something called the OWASP Top 10. And that has basically the way that if companies want to protect themselves from a software standpoint, what are the key things that you need to do in order to protect it? This includes things like input validation as an example. So if you have really strong input validation, you are going to be reducing your risks greatly. So that's one type of prioritization. Another type is the common weakness enumeration. It's going to provide you with a huge number of possible things to pay attention to from a development standpoint, but a lot of the scanners that pull off of the common weakness enumeration also have prioritization. Now, in the 2000s, and the concept of threat intelligence has been around for centuries. There's always a little bit of threat intelligence and a little bit of finding out what's going on. So, but from a cybersecurity perspective, threat intelligence is all about being able to determine who the threat actors are, what are some of the key methodologies you're using, what are some ways of detecting it, and how do you pull in all this information in order to make better sense of it. So these have been going on for ages. There are a lot of different vendors on the market. There are some open source methods. If you see over on the far right-hand side, there's something called the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities. So what CISA is doing is they've created that KEV, or another catalog of threat intelligence that's open on the open internet. It's letting you know that if there's a vulnerability, i.e. from the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, that has been exploited. So probably you want to prioritize those vulnerabilities. A lot of the vulnerability management tools today include threat intelligence in what they do, and they have, in some cases, they have their own mechanism, and they say this is how you should prioritize. Other vendors are going to tell you you have the ability to customize it and have it make sense in a manner that's appropriate for your organization. Some of them even allow some things like tagging, as an example. Tagging is extraordinarily important because then you could say, and this gets into the risk-based vulnerability management, this is a web server. I really want to protect that because if that gets compromised, any data coming into that web server can create some issues. That may not be appropriate for, say, an information-only web server, but in many cases, that's where credit cards are going to be taken. It's where information is going to be flowing through. So you really want to do that. So it helps you to prioritize and say, hey, let's take care of this. Or let's say, for example, you want to prioritize a database server because it's storing a massive amount of data. This is how you protect yourself from a risk-based standpoint. Again, that customization can be very useful. But a lot of companies are building that into their products. So that attack surface management, I did speak about before, but that also is something that's very important. That helps with the prioritization. But then you get to things like the attack pathway analysis that I also spoke about before. That too helps with the prioritization. and can be part of that risk-based vulnerability management. And of course, breach and attack simulation is another method that you could use. So what we're seeing here, especially over the last 10 years or so, there is an explosion of new types of vulnerability management that's being taken into account. Breach and attack simulation is a really critical part of that because it does prioritize. It lets you know what attackers are able to go after. And that's the whole point behind this next section, the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, or EPSS. Exploit Prediction Scoring System is becoming a de facto standard. And what it does, it tells you within a 30-day period of time, here is the most likely vulnerabilities to be exploited by a threat actor. So that's huge because it really helps you to prioritize a lot of your efforts. And then, of course, finally, we have the stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization. So all of these are meant to help and figure out what is the best way to approach things for protecting organizations today. But it gives you a sense that prioritization has become huge because of the large volume of vulnerabilities that organizations are having to deal with on a regular basis. Let's go into some of the Cyvergence threat and vulnerability services. We cover one-time assessments from vulnerability assessments and pen testing, but also there's like managed programs if you want crowdsourced pen testing. If you're looking for threat and vulnerability programs, we can run them. We can add in a lot of these types of tools to go along with what you need to do. And of course, the resale of threat and vulnerability tools as well. If you're looking to build something within your own organization, that's perfectly fine. We're happy to help you in that regard. That said, I want to thank everybody today for showing up. Feel free to like us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and all your favorite social media. And I want to thank you very much for your time today. And I look forward to hearing again from you soon. Thank you so much.